As president, Donald Trump defied norms. Now he's the first former U.S. leader to face federal criminal charges. He says it's a political hit job on his 2024 presidential campaign. But what does it mean for America and the future of its democracy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. It's an unprecedented moment in the history of the United States, one that's fraught with legal uncertainties and political implications. Former President Donald Trump has been charged in connection with the mishandling of classified documents. It's the first federal criminal indictment of a U.S. president. And now the nation is heading into uncharted territory, a year before a presidential election. Trump has called the indictment an abuse of power and an attempt to keep him out of the White House. There's lots to discuss with our guests, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
President Donald J. Trump.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump campaigning in Georgia 2 days after being indicted for mishandling classified documents. He says the charges are politically motivated.
The ridiculous and baseless indictment of me by the Biden administration's weaponized Department of Injustice will go down as among the most horrific abuses of power in the history of our country. Many people have said that. Democrats have even said it.
Trump is accused of keeping top-secret files after he left office, files that detailed the defense capabilities of the U.S. and its allies. The indictment says the FBI tried to recover them from his Mar-a-Lago home, but Trump asked his lawyer to hide the documents, destroy them, and say he was cooperating fully.
I never thought anything like this could happen in America.
Trump is the first former U.S. president to face federal criminal charges. Some of his predecessors came close. Bill Clinton was impeached on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice.
These allegations are false.
While Richard Nixon left office in disgrace.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
A grand jury named him as a co-conspirator in the Watergate scandal, but prosecutors were worried he wouldn't receive a fair trial and that it could worsen political divisions. President Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon meant the decision to indict was never taken.
Donald Trump, go away!
50 years on, there are concerns about the impact this case could have on a deeply divided society. If convicted, the former president could spend the rest of his life in prison.
In an important sense, this is unprecedented, these most recent events. We've got a former president who's seeking re-election, who's been indicted by the Department of Justice, that's overseen by his likely competitor in the upcoming election. These are an extraordinary set of events.
This indictment could have far-reaching consequences, not just for Trump, but also for U.S. democracy. Victoria Gatenby for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C. is Eric Ham, author of The GOP Civil War, Inside the Battle for the Soul of the Republican Party. Eric is also a former U.S. congressional staffer. In Baltimore is Debbie Hines, former Assistant Attorney General of Maryland and a former Baltimore prosecutor. And in London is Thomas Gift, Associate Professor and Founding Director of the Center on U.S. Politics at University College London. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Debbie, let me start with you today. This is the first time the Justice Department has ever brought federal charges against a former U.S. president. How much legal peril is Donald Trump facing right now, and how strong does this case against him look at the moment?
You know, I read the entire 42-page indictment against Donald Trump, and it's what's called a speaking indictment. In terms of an indictment, you don't always have to have full details in it. You can just have what we call a bare-bones indictment, which is just to let the party, the defendant, know what they're being charged in and just a little bit about the information. But what I love about this indictment is Special Counsel Jack Smith pretty much laid out everything, not just for Donald Trump, Trump, but for the American people to read and to understand what exactly occurred in this case. And he did it with not just words, but he did it with pictures. And if pictures say that 1,000 are worth 1,000 words, this indictment is really worth 1,000,000 because he has pictures, he has the words, he has what Donald Trump said in videotapes. And so it amounts to a 37-count indictment of Donald Trump for his willful retention of documents. And when we say willful, we mean not just you mistakenly kept documents, but over a period of time, even after he was repeatedly told to return the documents, we need the documents do not belong to you, he continued to keep each and every one of the documents. And the other additional counts are for obstruction of justice and for false statements. For each of all the counts combined, he actually is facing on, 20, the maximum, 20 years in prison on each, and for 10 years on the other counts each. So he really is facing a great deal of peril, but the indictment appears very solid against him because it is saying things in his own words that he said. And that's very rare for a prosecutor to have. That happens in movies, that happens in books, that happens in TV. But in real world life, we never generally see when we indict a defendant the actual words that the defendant says, that he knows that how the classified document system works. He knows that the system means that he doesn't get to keep the documents, and yet he keeps and hides the documents. So it's solid.
Eric, I saw you nodding along to some of what Debbie was saying there. It looked like you wanted to jump in, so go ahead.
Well, I think also, too, when we look at this indictment, not only is it stinging, not only is it damning, but also I think one of the things that we don't really address is how this makes the United States so vulnerable, because we're talking about a national security case. We're talking about some of the most highly classified and sensitive information, not just about the United States, but about the United States allies, war plans, some of the most key government agencies, such as the intelligence agency, the Pentagon. And the fact that this information was just left so haphazard around Donald Trump's estate, I think, is deeply problematic. And while there are so many who are politicizing this, I think we minimize just how this situation makes the United States less safe, not more.
Eric, let me follow up on that point you're making, because the indictment says that there are files that detail the defense capabilities of the U.S. and its allies that were left around in various places. I believe they say in ballrooms and in bathrooms as well. What does this mean when it comes to allies of the United States who are involved in intelligence sharing with the U.S.? And is it going to damage those relationships?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with former national security officials, current national security officials who focus on not just the reputation of the United States, but also when President Biden or any USG official walks into a room to meet with someone, you know, there is this automatic belief that there is some level of trust between the two. And when you look at the fact that just recently we saw a military official who is charged with taking classified documents, and now you have the former president of the United States who is alleged to have absconded with some of the most sensitive information and was not only refusing to give it back, but now is willing to risk going to prison for keeping these documents. It showcases not only the vulnerability, but also it puts so much in doubt, particularly when now the United States has to engage with other countries and its allies. And it begs the question of how safe is other countries' information with the United States. Already we've seen so many blunders, so many embarrassments with so much of this information coming out. And I think this is just another blow to the United States' credibility on the world stage.
Thomas, I want to ask you about a different aspect to all this. You know, there's one former president in particular who comes up a lot when discussing Trump, and that That former president is, of course, Richard Nixon. He resigned due to Watergate, but he was pardoned and thus, protected from any criminal prosecution. How much concern was there at the time of Nixon's resignation and then when Gerald Ford pardoned him that putting Nixon on trial could have worsened political divisions and tensions in the U.S.? And how does that compare with what's happening right now from your standpoint?
It's a really great question. And looking at historical parallels, I think it's natural to think about Richard Nixon, who was singled out by a grand jury in 1974 over Watergate, but he was an unindicted co-conspirator, at which point, of course, he resigned and avoided impeachment, which would have only been a political act and not a legal act. Reportedly, some members of the prosecution team then did consider bringing criminal charges against Nixon, but it never came to fruition, largely because of concerns about what it would mean for the country and what precedent it would set. Now, I do think that that case is a little bit different than the one that is in front of us now, precisely because it was Republicans, fellow allies of Richard Nixon, who turned on him. In this case, we don't have that. We have much more division where it's Democrats versus Republicans. We have seen some high-profile Republicans come out against Donald Trump, like Chris Christie, for example, who's running against him in the Republican primaries. But by and large, members of Congress, as well as his fellow competitors in the primaries, have essentially backed Trump. And so that's, I think, a key distinction here, whereas in the case of Nixon, pretty much everyone agreed that what he had done was wrong, that it was kind of willful malfeasance, and there was a general sense of bipartisanship that he needed to go. And that's one reason why Richard Nixon ultimately did tender his resignation. But in this case, we don't have that. And that's why it's so much different. We have Democrats versus Republicans at odds with one another, Republicans saying that this is essentially a weaponization of the justice system. And so it's very unique, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, Thomas, you brought up the rest of the Republican playing field right now. So let's take a step back and look at some of Trump's main Republican challengers. Ron DeSantis, he's framed his candidacy as more right-wing than Trump. As the governor of Florida, he's imposed new restrictions on abortion and loosened gun laws. Then there's former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. She positions herself as a conservative who can defend America's foreign policy interests abroad. Trump's close aide and former Vice President Mike Pence is also in the race. He criticized Trump's actions 2 years ago, which led to the attack on Congress. Now, Eric, let me ask you, much of the Republican Party has now cautiously rallied around Trump. Do you believe that that is going to gradually change as more details emerge?
No, it's not. In fact, if this indictment, which tells a very compelling story, does not shape or somehow begin to peel off some of those Republicans, and particularly those who are vying to be the next commander in chief, I don't think anything will. And I think what this does is this continues to embolden Donald Trump. It continues to allow him to share this story that somehow he was able to declassify these documents, even by doing so within his mind. And I think it only continues to increase greater polarization throughout the country, which is only deeply problematic. And if we're talking about allies around the world, what does this mean for those allies who are looking at Republicans and saying this is someone who had our most sensitive information and was so haphazard with it? But now you have people like Nikki Haley, a former UN ambassador, who is coming to his defense on how he handled these documents. What does that mean about how she will behave towards us and our information if she should happen to become the next commander-in-chief?
Debbie, when you hear what the reactions have been thus far, not only from other Republican candidates, but also from Republican leadership, how much does that concern you? I mean, does this sow more distrust in the justice system? You know, because Trump and his supporters have been painting themselves as victims. They've been pushing this narrative of being victims. So what does that do when it comes to trust in the legal systems in the U.S.?
This greatly concerns me because, I mean, unlike 50 years ago with Nixon or whenever, this is really, I hate to quote the quote that Joe Biden says, but this is really for the soul of democracy. This is all about democracy in America. I mean, what Trump is trying to do, as well as his allies and all the Republican leaders that are behind him, they are trying to turn this country into an authoritarian government. I don't know how we got to this point. I don't know why we couldn't see that we were moving towards this point. But this is what this is about. So this indictment is everything if we can get a conviction on it, because that is the movement where we're at. And I don't really see any change in the Republican candidates, in the Republican Party. This is where we are at this moment in time. And to be quite honest, it's quite scary.
Debbie, let me also ask you, Donald Trump, of course, he's denied all these charges. He is determined to stay in the presidential race, even if he is convicted. Can he actually continue to run for the presidency if he is convicted?
He cannot be president as convicted, but he would have the right to appeal. And that depends on if we get down the line to an appeal. But he could not be president as a convicted felon, which is what he would be if he were convicted. But the way the actual trial system works, I'm really concerned if he would actually, let alone get convicted, if he would actually have a trial in 2024. I mean, one of the problems that we're facing is, unfortunately, Attorney General Merrick Garland did not hand this case over to Special Counsel Jack Smith much earlier, and he ate up 2 years of time by not doing that. And so what that means is we're now basically staring down the gun of 2024 in an election year. And it becomes a point in time when there will probably be a judge, the judge who is assigned to the case, who is basically more likely to be on the lines of Donald Trump, as she's proven. Otherwise, Judge Cannon, who's like on the rah-rah team of Trump, to basically say we cannot go forward with a trial in this case because of the fact that he is running for president and he has all these engagements and commitments and everything going on. That's the real scary part, is really would we actually get to a trial before the election? And then he would not be convicted because he would be pending a trial. And if he were to win, God forbid, that would be the end of everything. Everything meaning he would just toss out, as he wants to do, the anything relating to the trials against him. So it's yet to be seen what would actually happen.
All right. Thomas, the responses that you're hearing thus far from the Republican side of the political spectrum, I mean, the fact that this is essentially split along partisan lines at this stage, I mean, is this what you expected?
Absolutely. I mean, everything is split along partisan lines, and it's been a consistent theme with Donald Trump. If we go back to the Mueller investigation over Russia, we think about impeachment 1.0. If we think about impeachment 2.0, think about January 6th. Consistently on every scandal, mini scandal, and everything in between, Republicans have rallied behind Donald Trump. We always hear these predictions that this time is different, that this is going to be the nail in the political coffin of Donald Trump. And each time that turns out not to be the case. And the real reason is fairly simple, and that is fellow Republicans on Capitol Hill and elsewhere are afraid of Donald Trump's base, because Donald Trump's base is so loyal and they constitute the core of the Republican electorate. And so I don't think that this case is going to be any different than any other case that we have seen in terms of just the sheer politics. Donald Trump's base is notoriously loyal. We all know that. It's stubborn, it's resistant, and to some extent, it's even galvanized by these kinds of accusations that are levied against Donald Trump. Donald Trump's using this to fundraise. We're already seeing some boost in his poll numbers. I think we can expect that to be more of the same, which is one reason why Donald Trump remains the prohibitive favorite to win the GOP nomination for president.
Eric, you heard Thomas there talking about the loyalty of Trump's base. I want to ask you, from your vantage point, is there anything at all at this stage that could emerge that would cause Trump's base to start abandoning him?
I don't think so. But also, too, I think there is this aspect of diminishing returns. We saw Donald Trump in 2016 lose the popular vote by 3 million votes. And in 2020, he lost the popular vote by 7 million votes. And so I think what we're seeing here is while Donald Trump's base is certainly resilient, is certainly going to stand by him no matter what, it simply is not enough to actually deliver him the White House. And so while it might be enough to actually win him the primary, it's just not enough to deliver in a general election because many of the votes and voters that he will need to win in a general election have been so turned off by him. And I think when we look more deeply at this case that Jack Smith has recently brought, and as the court proceedings continue to play out in Manhattan, and as we see what's going to happen in Georgia with the case in Fulton County by prosecuting attorney Fani Willis, I think all of that combined is going to be very difficult for Donald Trump to overcome in a general election. And that is why I think you continue to see Joe Biden say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And the alternative is what Donald Trump brings to the table, and it simply is just not enough.
Debbie, the special counsel, Jack Smith, who filed these charges, he said prosecutors were going to seek a speedy trial. Earlier, you were talking about potential timelines for a trial. But from your vantage point, how quickly could all this proceed? I mean, how quickly could a trial be put on?
So the way it works is when they go in, when I believe it's Tuesday, Donald Trump will enter a plea. And at some point, very shortly after that, and this is on a very fast docket in federal court, and particularly in the county that they're in, West Palm Beach. So the prosecution says that it will take 21 days for them to try their case. That is quick. And then whatever, the defendant doesn't have to put on a case, but whatever time the defendant would need to put on a case. But a lot depends on the judge's calendar as well, because this is not the only case that Judge Cannon has on her calendar. There would also be motions that would be had that precede a case. So in reality, there is time to have the case presented very, very quickly and very soon and in the spring of 2024. But just, you know, what I've said before, a lot of that depends on the judge. It depends on the judge and what the judge determines, because it is the judge that determines the scheduling of the case. And this judge is pro-Trump. Now, maybe she will be less pro-Trump because she's got her hands spanked before when she tried to basically apply, you know, her opinions towards Trump that were totally invalid. But we just don't know. And you know, her name is Cannon, and she is basically a loose cannon. And that is the concern in the case. She's the one that's going to set the trial schedule. But it's definitely possible if we didn't have Judge Cannon on the case for the case to be tried, and there wouldn't be any problems if it being so close to the election, such that she would defer and say, oh, we just can't have the case go forward.
Thomas, I want to talk for a moment about the impact all this could potentially have on President Biden, because President Biden has maintained that he's not commenting on all this, and he's essentially trying to stay above the fray. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, it's the Justice Department under the Biden administration that is carrying this out. So I'm curious, from your perspective, does that start to look to a segment of the American population as though Joe Biden is going after his chief political rival? And then what impact does that have on Joe Biden?
Well, to a segment of the population, absolutely, that's going to be the perception. You know, this case is shrouded in politics. There's just no escaping it. So federal prosecutors were going to be accused of acting in a partisan way, whichever way they pivoted. Either they wouldn't indict and they'd be accused of granting Trump special privileges and of having a two-tiered system of justice, or they would indict, as they did, and they'd be accused of election interference, of orchestrating a political vendetta. Attorney General Merrick Garland tried to mitigate that problem by delegating discretion over the prosecution to Jack Smith, but it doesn't insulate fully the Department of Justice, or the White House for that matter, from the specter, the specter of partiality. Jack Smith still reports to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is still part of the executive branch. And so that's the through line that Trump is drawing. And it's one that Democrats also raised when they accused former Attorney General Bill Barr of weaponizing the Department of Justice, for example, to defend Trump in the wake of the Mueller investigation and elsewhere. So everything about what Jack Smith is doing, his comments earlier, everything contained in the 37 counts against Donald Trump, it's going to be scrutinized through that political lens. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot that Joe Biden can do, despite what he has done, which is just, I don't have any comment on this. I'm not weighing in. But of course, that this is the case that Donald Trump is trying to make, that Republicans are trying to make, that essentially he's just weaponizing the department to take out Joe Biden's most likely contender in the 2024 election.
All right, we just have about 3 minutes left, so I want to end the show by asking you all the same question. We are at an unprecedented moment in American history, and I want to ask each of you what this moment means for the U.S. going forward. Eric, I'll let you go first.
I think we're in a battle for democracy in the United States, and many thought that when Donald Trump lost, that somehow the country had won. Many think that this prosecution of Donald Trump is a suggestion that democracy is winning. And I'm not so sure that's the answer or the takeaway from what we're seeing play out. And I think we really won't know the answer to that until maybe 2, 3, even 5 years from now.
Debbie, what do you say? What does this moment mean for America right now and going forward?
It's a make it or break it moment. I mean, that's just the bottom line. I don't think that I agree that even if there is a conviction of Donald Trump, we have gone so far down the rabbit hole in this country. I don't think that that's going to get us moving out of the rabbit hole. And I don't want to sound like the pessimist, but I think that with all the other Republican leaders out there that want to be a light, L-I-T-E Donald Trump, it just is not going to go away. It will definitely be better if Donald Trump is convicted and he goes away, but this is definitely a make it or break it moment in terms of if he is not convicted and he is allowed to get anywhere near that White House moment again, it's just over.
And Thomas, what do you say? This moment that we're in, what does it mean for the United States of America? What does it mean for it now, and what does it mean for the future?
Well, I'll try to end a little bit on a hint of optimism, and that is absolutely the country is going through very fraught times. It's highly polarized, and the strains that Donald Trump has induced on American democracy are unlike those that we have really ever seen before. At the same time, I do think that there is a lot of catastrophizing about American democracy. There's a lot of hyperbolizing about American democracy. I don't think that American democracy fundamentally is at stake. I think it's being tested, it's being strained, maybe to the breaking point. But what we saw in the aftermath of 2020 is actually kind of the courts and the political system and the legal system operating as it should. Donald Trump made this unprecedented claim of election rigging. And what happened? Well, Donald Trump is not in the White House right now, despite his best efforts. Most of these actually played out through the courts in the way that they should have been, and most of them were dismissed in the way that they should have been. So in this case in particular, what we're going to see is also the legal system take shape and play out as it should. Donald Trump will ultimately be judged by 12 jurors, peers of his, and they'll make the final determination. So it's a difficult period for the United States, but I don't think that this is an existential crisis.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Eric Ham, Debbie Hines, and Thomas Gift. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.